Yes, I worked for ABN AMRO, for a Dutch bank. And they have a very old tradition from the merchant days going back hundreds of years. We were doing relatively normal transactions. Anyways, through what I was, by normal I mean mergers, acquisition, you know, the nonsense that they do here in this world. But through that work I met several interesting people who were again studying astrology, who were people interested in art. We were doing art transactions, the normal things that you do in banks when you advise private clientele. I then found a group of people who were interested in what I was doing in my part-time life, and they were living in Florida, and they said, why don't you come and live in Florida? I was ready to leave this whole thing I was doing simply because it makes no sense, in my view anyway, to be part of this world, of which I knew early on that it wasn't going to last. I knew pretty early on that while I'm still alive, now here in this life, this is all going to disappear in some way. So what was the point in being part of that, when I knew you better prepare for something else? Now, after I finished my book, I had other ideas of what kind of topics I'd like to get into, which are more about what people should do with what we know that's going to happen. And I had wanted to be applied, or that people understood me clearly enough so that they knew what to do with what I know, which is what they know deep down, but they can't verbalize it yet. So my whole purpose now is more showing people what to do about the years ahead, because there is a really great, fascinating future. We're going to discover things that we were just talking about that are sort of occult in the past, but very scientific and simple in the very near future. By near future, I mean 6-7 years from now. This will all be totally normal to talk about these things. So this is your transition, coming out of a real world, normal career, but that was abbreviated and compressed so that by the age of 32, 33, I was well on my way. That was 14 years ago, doing my own thing. But it took me that time to actually finish the book, because it was a long study. And in certain fields of the astrological studies and extraterrestrial interaction and cosmology, I had to study quite deeply, and there are very few who have a clue about this. I mean, when it comes down to maybe 4 or 5 people that I was lucky enough to meet that actually know about quantum physics, about cosmology, about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and certain subjects, that there are very, very few, maybe a handful of people who really have spent 20, 40 years of their lives. Those are older guys. Or an astronaut who had spent all of his life studying these things. So I had to meet all these people by chance, by whatever you want to call it. I met these people and was able to thread together what would be of interest for a person who is just vaguely interested in what is the future of mankind, what is this planet going to be about, and maybe also where do we come from.
Can you mention some names for me?
Oh, you mean
Edgar Mitchell?
Yes, the astronaut, Dr. Edgar Mitchell. Yes, I talked to him for a while. He wrote a book himself about these subjects. His book is called The Way of the Explorer. And he describes basically a transition from a scientist, astronaut, pilot, into a man who lives with the other world, but he tries to be scientific about it. And we talked about a number of subjects. I don't mention too much in the book because there are certain things that we agreed that I could not say for a while.
Okay.
I respect my sources, but I can say I respect their wishes. I mean, and I can say I met him, but I can't be too specific about what he told me.
He did tell you something about the extraterrestrial presence on Earth. Isn't that right?
Yes. Well, it's not so much him. To him, I think it is clear what he says in interviews. You can read it up, and interviews that are on the internet. I think colleagues of his were much more clearer, so he can always refer to the colleagues. No, but I've met other people who know what they're talking about, who had the direct contact than I myself had. So when it comes to that subject, we are our source. He simply has put in more poetic terms at the beginning of his book that he felt that he was part of something bigger. That's a simple way to put it.
Okay, and you also, would you name any of the other people that you perhaps have dealt with or, got certain information from?
There was another scientist at NASA. He's not well known. That's just someone very, very advanced on a scientific level. And I've been in contact with a number of people over the years via the internet, via correspondence, writing, phoning. So yes, I mean, it would be too long to explain who. The last one that I've been in touch with, on and off, is Jerry Zeitlin. Zeitlin is a scientist, an engineer, who has worked for SETI, and he left SETI. He's now a retired scientist. And I think the most interesting part of his work is he didn't translate, but he adapted and introduced a brand new work by a French guy called Anton Parks. Anton Parks wrote a book called Le Secret des Étoiles Sombres, The Secret of the Dark Stars. And in The Secret of the Dark Stars, he explains basically where we came from, how long ago this whole story is, which extraterrestrial races mixed with which. It's way too long to explain even in 2 or 3 sentences. It's just too long to explain. And Zeitlin took this whole thing and made an introductory note on the internet. And that is maybe the most advanced piece of knowledge that is right now around in 2006.
Oh, that's fabulous.
I had more or less the same impression, hadn't written it in that way, although we shouldn't make conclusions. We're always finished when we come to conclusions, but I think it is a foregone conclusion that we're not from here, but we're from the stars. How it exactly came about, there we have huge latitude, different theories, but there are searchers around who have a clue about this, and some who have had a direct interaction, not necessarily physically like Billy Meyer, but who have knowledge that comes to them. Now and coming through, when I say comes through them via language, via advanced or ancient languages that are universal to hear and to write down.
But you yourself consider yourself to be of Syrian descent, is that right?
Yeah, you can see the face, that's serious, yes. And the elven ears.
Oh, really?
You can usually tell by faces,
yes,
more or less what genetics people have, yes. Yes, you can do that.
So you have insight into this?
Sure, yes. Those people who have a clue, they can pretty much say what the preponderance of genetics are.
And it's probably, you also have Celtic.
Yes,
this is
definitely,
true.
yes.
And St. Clair has a history. Your last name, isn't
The
this
last
right?
name is a Celtic name, yes.
Yes. But it also goes into, you know, sort of, again, the occult. The St. Clairs going all the way back to, is this the Jesus bloodline?
Personally, this whole Jesus business, if you want my personal opinion, I think...
Yes, I do.
Okay. First of all, it's not so important as people think, because there were many of them, and his story is not the way it's being told. I think he was a master who came, among other things, from Sirius. There's probably a Syrian connection in him. And it wasn't his name, as you know from B.D. Meyer's contact reports with the Pleiadians, or Pleiadians as he calls them. His name was more likely Emmanuel. Maybe there were even 2 or 3 people like him. We're not so sure that. The birth date was not when they say it was more at 4-5 BC. And his whole journey was, in my opinion, not towards south of France, England and the Celtic place, but it was back into the direction of India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and maybe Japan. And he certainly didn't die on a cross and none of these things. I don't want to go into this too much and shock people, but I think what's important is people need to have a very open mind.